Satellite television programs.
Hello, teacher. Hello, students. Welcome to today's lesson on polar and nonpolar covalent molecules. Last time, we discussed covalent bonding. We learned that covalent bonds are the attractive force between positively charged nuclei of atoms and the shared electrons in a molecule. The electrostatic attraction that is between the two positively charged nuclei, as well as the two negatively charged electrons, hold the atoms in the molecule together. We also learned about the difference between covalent and ionic bonds. While covalent bonds involve the sharing of valence electrons between atoms, ionic bonds involve the transfer of electrons from one atom to another. Both bonds occur so that the atoms involved can gain a stable electron configuration. In today's lesson, we will be distinguishing between polar and nonpolar covalent molecules. Students, if you are ready, then we will get started. As you know, covalent bonds are formed when atoms share electron pairs. Some molecules are made up of two atoms that are identical, such as hydrogen molecules. In these molecules, the electrons are shared equally between the atoms. A covalent bond in which the electrons are shared equally between the two atoms is called a nonpolar covalent bond. In other words, nonpolar bonds are covalent bonds in which electrons are shared equally between atoms. This results in a balanced distribution of electrical charge. What about molecules that are made up of different atoms, such as hydrogen chloride? While hydrogen and chlorine are covalently bonded in hydrogen chloride molecules, they are still two different elements. Therefore, they do not share the bonding electrons equally. A chemical bond in which shared electrons spend more time in the vicinity of one atom than the other is called a polar covalent bond, or, more simply, a polar bond. Teacher, please separate the students into groups of 3 or 4. Students, in your groups, compare and contrast nonpolar and polar covalent bonds. You may begin now.
Students, let's get ready. begin. Time's up! Let's get back to our lesson.
Hello, everyone. I hope that you worked well with your group to complete this activity. As a comparison, you were correct to say that both nonpolar and polar covalent bonds involve the sharing of valence electrons. As a contrast, nonpolar covalent bonds are formed between atoms that have equal electronegativity, whereas polar covalent bonds are formed between atoms that have different electronegativity, As a result, in nonpolar covalent bonds, there is equal attraction for the shared pair of electrons by the nuclei of the bonding atoms. In polar covalent bonds, the shared pairs of electrons will be more attracted toward the nucleus of the more electronegative atom. Great work, students! As you know, electronegativity is the ability of an atom to attract the shared electrons in a chemical bond towards itself. Polarity is caused when two atoms forming a bond together have different electronegativities. Elements that possess a high electronegativity are more apt to attract electrons than are elements with low electronegativity. Let us look at hydrogen chloride again as an example. The chlorine atom in this molecule has a higher electronegativity than the hydrogen atom. Therefore, the shared pair of electrons is more attracted to the nucleus of the chlorine atom than it is to that of hydrogen. As a result, the chlorine atom gets a partial negative charge, which is represented as delta minus. By contrast, hydrogen gets a partial positive charge, which is represented as delta plus. However, rather than saying delta, it is read as partial or slightly. Molecules that have both a positive and a negative end are said to be polar. These molecules have a dipole, which means that they have two poles. Evidence has shown that in hydrogen chloride molecules, the electrons spend more time near the chlorine atom. This unequal sharing of electrons can be thought of as a partial electron transfer. It can also be thought of as a shift in electron density, as you can see here. Students, you are going to see several sentences appear on the screen, one at a time. However, each sentence will be incomplete. Please read the sentences carefully and fill in the blank spaces.
Students, let's get ready. Begin. Time's up. Let's get back to our lesson.
Hello again, students. Were you able to complete all of the sentences correctly? Let us complete them together. Covalent bonds are formed when atoms share electron pairs. Non-polar bonds are covalent bonds in which electrons are shared equally between atoms. A chemical bond in which shared electrons spend more time in the vicinity of one atom than the other is called a polar covalent bond. Molecules that have both a positive and a negative end are said to be polar. Elements that possess a high electronegativity are more apt to attract electrons than are elements with low electronegativity. Well done, students! In today's lesson, we learned about polar and non-polar covalent molecules. We learned that non-polar covalent bonds are those in which the electrons are shared equally between the two atoms. Polar covalent bonds are those in which shared electrons spend more time in the vicinity of one atom than the other. We learned that atoms that have a higher electronegativity have a tendency to attract the electrons more than atoms that have a lower electronegativity. This brings us to the end of our lesson. Until next time, thank you, teacher. Thank you, students.